Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. The other day I watched a video interview of this gentleman who reverted from Quran alone Islam back to traditional Sunni Islam, and he even made a video explaining why he has reverted back to traditional Islam. And he justified his reasoning using Surah 2, verse 143, the verse that talks about the change in the Qiblah. And the points that he raised are really nothing new. Traditional Muslims often quote this verse in an attempt to show that the messenger received secondary revelations besides the Quran. So today we're going to address these claims. Let's begin. Now, in 2:143, we read, "We did not make the focal point, the Qiblah, that you became on, except to distinguish who follows the messenger from those who will turn on their heels." The claim that traditional Muslims make here is that God has inspired the messenger to follow the first Qiblah, which is not mentioned in the Quran. And this indicates that the messenger was receiving secondary revelations, what they call the Sunnah, and we are supposed to follow those secondary revelations. This is the claim that the traditional Muslims make here. Of course, the problem with this type of claim is that if we actually read the verse very carefully in conjunction with the context, we will see that God never inspired to the Prophet to follow any Qiblah prior to the Quranic revelations. I repeat, God never inspired to the messenger to follow any Qiblah before the Quranic revelations. So the whole idea that God was telling the Prophet to follow the first Qiblah, which isn't mentioned in the Quran, has no basis whatsoever. So let's begin with reading the context, because it is through this context we'll be able to understand whether God was truly inspiring the Prophet to follow this first Qiblah or not. By the way, I do have a couple of videos on the topic of the Qiblah, and I actually have a different understanding of what Qiblah is. But for the sake of keeping things simple and clear, we're going to go by the traditional understanding of the word Qiblah here. What's also interesting, and I recently found this out, is that Brother Sam Gerrans also reached the same conclusions about the word Qiblah as I have. Anyway, let's begin with verse 142. It says, "The foolish from among the people will say, what has turned them away from the Qiblah that they were on?" So, a certain group of people have noticed that the Prophet and his followers were following a certain Qiblah, and they turned away from it. And then they asked him why, or they asked why were they doing that? The Prophet responded by saying, "To God are the east and the west. He guides whomever he wills to a straight path." Now, the fact that the Prophet responded by telling them, "To God are the east and the west," it indicates that God is everywhere. He is not in any certain direction or location. This also indicates for us that the Prophet did not have a set Qiblah, as they claim. The fact that he turned away from this Qiblah indicates that it was not set for him, not divinely set. This is further reinforced in verse 144. It says, "We see the shifting of your face toward the heaven." Why did he shift his face toward the heaven? Obviously, because he did not have a set Qiblah. He was basically facing all sorts of Qiblahs on his own volition. God did not tell him to face any certain direction. This is again further reinforced in the next phrase, "We will thus set you a Qiblah that will be pleasing to you." Again, this indicates that the Prophet was facing all sorts of different Qiblahs, and he was not pleased with any one of them. And now God is going to set a Qiblah for him that is pleasing to him. And as we can see in verse 145, if we read this verse, we will see that the people of the book had a variety of different Qiblahs that they were following. Each one had their own unique Qiblah. So the Prophet was on his own volition following certain Qiblahs without any inspiration, without direction from God. He was not pleased with any of them. Then he started shifting his face toward the heaven, asking God for a Qiblah. And then God set one for him that is pleasing to the Prophet. Okay, so this is all evident that the Prophet never received any inspiration to follow any Qiblah prior to the Quranic revelations. We can either believe God or we can believe what the books of the Hadith and the Sunnah are telling us. However, God's scripture always prevails. So as we have seen from the context alone, God never ordered the Prophet to follow any Qiblah prior to the Quranic revelations. It was the Prophet on his own volition that was following that first Qiblah and then stopped because he wasn't pleased with it, and then God sent him inspiration through the Quran to follow Masjid al-Haram. Now, let's delve into the verse that's actually in question, verse 143. It reads, "We did not make the Qiblah that you became on except to distinguish who follows the messenger from those who will turn on their heels." Now, unfortunately, the gentleman that made that video, as well as traditional Muslims generally speaking, are not sensitive enough to appreciate the key terms that are used throughout the Quran. In this verse, God shifts between Muhammad the man, as indicated by the word you, and Muhammad the messenger, as indicated by the word messenger. And this, by the way, this shift from Muhammad the man to Muhammad the messenger to even Muhammad the prophet is a common thing that happens throughout the Quran. In this verse, God shifts between Muhammad the man and Muhammad the messenger. The difference is that Muhammad the man is just that, the man himself, whereas Muhammad the messenger is Muhammad specifically carrying and implementing the message of God, which is the Quran. So God here says, we did not make the Qibla that you, Muhammad, were on. So God does not use the word messenger here. He uses the word you, Muhammad, Muhammad the man. This indicates that it's Muhammad on his own volition that was on this Qibla. It was not a command. It was not a divine command from God. Otherwise, the word messenger would have been used. But instead, again, God uses the word you, which means that it's Muhammad on his own that was on that Qibla. Some people might argue, though, that the word make that's used here indicates that God made Muhammad be on that Qibla. And this is incorrect. The word make, which is ja'alna in the Quran, ja'alna does not mean to inspire, and it does not mean to command. The word make or ja'alna means to assemble something in a way or in a fashion to allow something to happen. So it's basically an allowance, okay? So God says, we did not make, i.e. allow the Qibla that you, Muhammad, were on. Again, this phrase in of itself is sufficient to tell us that it was Muhammad on his own that was on that first Qibla. It was not a divine command. Now the question is, why did God allow Muhammad to be on that first Qibla in the first place? The answer is in the remainder of the passage. To distinguish who follows the messenger from those who will turn on their heels. Notice here that God has shifted to the term messenger. Why? Because God wanted to test the people to see if they will follow the message, i.e. the Quran, the Quranic inspiration, the Quranic command to shift from the first Qibla that Muhammad was on to the Quranic Qibla, which is Masjid al-Haram. So it was a test for the people, as indicated by the remainder of this verse. So it's as simple as that, folks. The claim that the traditional Muslims are making in this verse is incorrect. God, in this phrase, does not say that he inspired the Prophet to follow a first Qibla. Instead, God teaches us and tells us that the Muhammad on his own volition was following that first Qibla, and God wanted to test them to see if they were willing to change that Qibla with the messenger to Masjid al-Haram. So from the first Qibla to Masjid al-Haram. That was the test. And when they shifted to Masjid al-Haram, that is when they were considered as followers of the messenger. This is all that this verse is talking about. And unfortunately, the traditional Muslims are using this particular verse in order to justify that there is some secondary revelations given to the Prophet, and attempting to say that it's the Sunnah where we'll find this information, which is completely wrong. And as we have seen, this passage, this verse, as well as the context, all dictate otherwise than what they have claimed. Assalamu alaikum, and inshallah, see you in the next video.